Well, we're going to go ahead and get started so we have more time to spend with Rocky. So let me give a brief intro for those of you who are new to art history, and this might be your first time hearing about the world of art history. Dr. Rocky Ruggiero has been a professor of art and architecture since 1999. He received his BA from the College of the Holy Cross and a Master's of Arts degree from Syracuse University, where he was awarded a prestigious Florence Fellowship in 1996. He furthered his art historical studies at the University of Exeter, UK, where he received his PhD in art history and visual culture. In addition to lecturing for various American universities in Florence, Italy, including Syracuse, Kent State, Vanderbilt, and Boston College, Rocky has starred in various TV documentaries concerning the Italian Renaissance. He recently appeared as an expert witness for NBC News, as well as the History Channel's Engineering and Empire, Da Vinci's World, and Museum Secrets, the Uffizi Gallery, and the recent National Geographic Nova PBS program on Brunelleschi's dome entitled Great Cathedral Mystery, which I have shown several times in my classes. So thank you for that, Rocky.
You're very welcome.
After living in Florence, Italy for 20 years, Rocky and his family moved to East Greenwich, Rhode Island, and he now divides his time between the US and Italy. In the US, he offers specialized lectures as a paid speaker on art and architecture history, educational seminars on subjects ranging from ancient art and architecture through the Italian Baroque, and cultural events throughout the country. In Italy, Rocky offers private excursions and adult programs in Florence, Rome, Vienna, Siena, and Northern Italy. Rocky also shares his knowledge and love of Italian art as an academic advisory board member of the nonprofit group Friends of Florence, and as a frequent collaborator and lecturer for the Friends of the Uffizi Gallery, both which have provided funds for the restoration of numerous works of art throughout Florence. He also lectures and serves as a college liaison for the prestigious J. Pritzker Academy in Siem Reap, Cambodia. So with that, welcome to the Emeritus Institute, Rocky, and take it away.
Thank you, Eva Marie. It's a pleasure to be here. Buongiorno to all of you. You are obviously on the West Coast, so it is still morning. We're here on the East Coast. We're in the afternoon. And if you don't know, this is that rather ambiguous time period where in Italy, we usually don't know how to greet each other. The buongiorno, or the good morning, which usually runs till about lunchtime. Buonasera, which is good evening. But that doesn't normally start until about 4, maybe 5 p.m. in the evening. So I'll just simply say hi with a big salve to all of you. It is indeed a pleasure to be here today, giving actually one of my absolute favorite lectures, which I entitled Michelangelo Masaccio and Giotto, the chapels that define the Renaissance. And chronologically speaking, we should actually invert the order of the artist's name, because technically speaking, Giotto is the earliest of all, a painter active in the 14th century. Masaccio, instead, the inventor of Renaissance painting, active in the 15th century. And then Michelangelo, who was largely active in the 16th century instead. And so each of their works kind of defining an epic, defining their centuries, but in many ways equally important, as you're going to discover today. Now, let us begin. And again, if you know me, you know that I am obsessive about chronology. So I will be moving through these chapels in the order in which they were constructed and decorated. So our journey begins in the northern Italian city of Padua. Right now, Padua is located about 20 minutes west of Venice. And if you've ever taken a train to Venice, I guarantee you your train has passed through Padua before finally making its stop in the Venezia Santa Lucia train station. And if any of you are planning a trip to Italy anytime soon and are heading to Venice, be sure to allot some time to jump off the train in Padua, to walk about a mile from the train station to the structure that you're looking at right now, the so-called Scrovegni Chapel, all right, which was built and decorated between the years 1303 to 1305 by this Florentine painter named Giotto. So I repeat, we're in Padua, but the artist is from Florence. I also repeat the correct pronunciation of that name, Giotto, because oftentimes I hear people mutilating that name with an English accent when they say Giotto. But after spending a morning with me, folks, I expect that all of you walk away pronouncing that name properly and that you also perform the dramatic hand gesture when you say Giotto. Okay? Now, the work is very simply a family chapel that was once situated next to the palace of a family named Scrovegni. That's where the name actually comes from. And if you look at my little caption there, you'll see the word arena written in parentheses, because in English, this chapel is often referred to as the Arena Chapel as well. Because if you look carefully at the image, you can see this sort of brick arcade that runs off to the right-hand side. That is what's left of an ancient Roman amphitheater or an ancient Roman arena, which is where the nickname Arena Chapel actually came from. Padua in ancient Roman times was called Patuvium. This actually was the main Roman city in the region that we call the Veneto today. And as was very common in the Middle Ages, they would actually use ancient ruins as foundations for medieval buildings, right? Why bother laying new foundations when you already have them right there? And so what happened was essentially that they decided to build the family, the Scrovegni family, their palace and their chapel, essentially onto the site of an ancient Roman amphitheater. The structure is not that big. In fact, I like this photograph because you can see the person here standing just in front. And if this person were standing here by the main door, her head would reach up to about there. Not a massive structure, but by 14th century standards, enormous in scale. Because remember, most time chapels were located inside of churches. They were not usually freestanding like you actually see today. And another rather interesting point, Eva Marie mentioned that I'm part of these organizations that raise quite a bit of money for art conservation and restoration. Well, right now at the Scrovegni Chapel, they employ a cutting-edge technique to conserve the structure by purifying the visitors who go inside. Now, keep in mind, if any of you are planning a visit to the Scrovegni Chapel, you have to make a reservation. Okay? You can't get in here without a reservation because they limit the number of people that are actually allowed in 15-minute intervals. I think it's 25 people every 15 minutes or so. That in an attempt, of course, to limit the amount of temperature fluctuation, humidity fluctuation as well. But before you actually go into the chapel, you enter into this glass room that you see. This was all built in the early 2000s, and visitors will sit in this room for a full 15 minutes. So there are a bunch of people in the room, there are a bunch of people inside the chapel. And when you're in the room, you are being deionized. In other words, all of the pollutants that you have on you are being sucked away. The floor is made of, or it's carpeted with a special type of material that cleans the bottom of your shoes. The entire time you're unaware of this because you're watching a film about the actual paintings inside the chapel. And then when the doors open up, they're hermetically sealed doors. You walk out of the box and into the chapel, and the people inside of the chapel walk out and through the corridor and outside as well. It is still technically cutting edge conservation. And in fact, there's been murmurings that perhaps the Sistine Chapel, which you see here behind me in my virtual background, will also sooner or later employ something similar to this because the numbers of people visiting the Sistine Chapel is absolutely frightening. And nothing is being done to conserve it, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. This is what it looks like from the outside. I dare say not much to look at, but the inside instead is an absolutely extraordinary decorative complex, right? In fact, some people maintain that Giotto may have actually been the architect of the building as well. We don't know for certain, but considering the disposition of the building, which consists almost entirely of paintable wall surface, to me, I think it's logical to presume that perhaps it was indeed a painter who designed it. So we're looking essentially from the front door towards the apse of the chapel. And if you look carefully, you'll see these three sculptures, two of which were carved by a very celebrated sculptor named Giovanni Pisano. And then behind it, we have a sarcophagus, or a stone coffin. And in fact, that is the sarcophagus of the patron of the chapel, whose name was Enrico Scrovegni. So first and foremost, like most religious chapels, the function of this one was funerary. In other words, it is the resting place, it is the burial place of this Enrico Scrovegni. Right? And you can see the fresco decorations that I mentioned, which decorate just about every square inch of the wall and ceiling surface. And in fact, when we start looking at the scenes, we start reading the scenes, we will read them left to right, top to bottom, beginning up here in the upper left-hand corner of the chapel. Now, lest I forget, later on we'll be talking about the Sistine Chapel as well. And what I want you to realize is that before the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel looked like what it does in my virtual background, it more than likely looked like what you have up on your screen right now. The most conventional way to paint chapel and or church ceilings was to paint those ceilings blue and to then decorate with golden stars the way you see right here, which makes perfect sense, right? You're supposed to be looking up into the sky. So I want you to realize that in and of itself, for Michelangelo to have painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel as elaborately as he did was an exceptional thing. And that's part of the reason why the Sistine is indeed, excuse me, so important. So this is what it looks like looking into the Scrovegni Chapel. This instead is what it looks like looking back out, right? This is the door that we saw from the outside just a moment ago. And as was also typical medieval convention, the subject of the fresco on the interior facade wall is the Last Judgment, the end of days, Armageddon, the apocalypse, call it whatever you like. And the idea, of course, is that as a attendee of the chapel, that is one of the faithful, member of the congregation, walked out, he or she would be reminded of his or her mortality by the image that they actually saw. But by just looking at this Last Judgment image, you're immediately given an idea of the type of personality that the artist had. Because most Last Judgment images are absolutely pessimistic in their message. Because remember, if you want to read the literary source for Last Judgment, you go to the last book of the Judeo-Christian Bible called the Book of Revelation, which specifically states that there is only room for 144,000 people in heaven. That's it. Then they shut the doors. So the idea is that a vast majority of us will instead be going to hell. So by simply looking at a Last Judgment representation, you get that message, because most of the time, 3/4 of a Last Judgment space is dedicated to hell, whereas only about 1/4 instead is dedicated to heaven. When you look at Giotto's representation here instead, you'll notice that hell, which is right there, is about equal in size to heaven. Because Giotto was a rather optimistic painter at a time when there weren't too many optimistic people in the world. And I think his philosophy was, why linger on the fact that we're all going to suffer eternal torment and burn in hell? We already know that. Let us instead focus on the side of the saved. And so if you look at the figure of Jesus Christ right here below the window, you'll also notice that Jesus is focusing all of his attention to his right-hand side. So remember, the sides indicate his judgment. The right-hand side is the side of the elect, that limited number of people who will be allowed into heaven because they were virtuous enough, and they're right here. Whereas the left side, the sinistra, the sinister side, instead alludes to those of us, and I'll probably see you all down there, by the way, who will instead be condemned to eternal suffering in hell, which is what you actually see right there. It's just an extraordinarily uncharacteristic medieval Last Judgment, where again, the emphasis is normally on those who will be condemned into hell. And right here above the door is a very important image for understanding the chapel. And it is of the patron himself Enrico Scrovegni, who you see right here with his red robe, giving the chapel. I mean, you can see how detailed a reproduction this actually is of the chapel proper, over to these three female figures. Right? Now, there is some debate as to exactly who these three figures represent. The central one, I admit, looks rather Marian. In other words, she looks like the Virgin Mary. But you'll notice that her two companions have halos as well. So there's been a lot of debate regarding their identity, but I think it's actually, the colors that they wear that give away their identities. And that is white, red, and green, which have nothing to do with the Italian flag, if that's what you're thinking, but instead with the colors associated with the three theological virtues, which are faith, and remember, faith, which is associated with the color white, hope, which is associated with the color green, and love. And a synonym for love is charity. So faith in white, love in red, hope in green. Why is Enrico Scrovegni, who spent lavishly on building this chapel and having Giotto decorate it, giving this chapel over to the three virtues? Well, the reason we think is that Enrico Scrovegni was a usurer by profession. And if you don't know, usury means lending money on interest, right? Now, today, the connotation of usury is that you're lending money on exaggeratedly high interest rates. But in the Middle Ages, usury is very simply lending money on interest, because the Catholic Church was against lending money on interest. The reason is because if you did, you could control time. By determining how a loan was paid back, technically you are controlling time, and only God should be able to control time. So the church said, you cannot lend money on, you can lend money, but don't expect it back with any interest. Well, I think as most of you probably already know, most of the more prominent families in Italy and Europe in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, names like Medici and Strozzi, made their money doing just that, that is lending money on interest. So the idea was that if you gave some of that money back in the form of pious patronage, in other words, spending the money to glorify God, to glorify the church, then it was okay somehow. And that's exactly what you see here. Now, if you ever read up on the Scrovegni Chapel, one of the most common things that you will read is that Enrico actually paid for the chapel and its decoration because he was the victim of some character assassination in a very popular book circulating at the beginning of the 14th century, which was known as the Inferno. And if you don't know, the Inferno is the first of the three books that make up the trilogy called the Divine Comedy, which was written, sorry, I have art history on the brain, which was written by the Florentine poet Dante. All right, now it's an interesting association because in the, I believe, 17th canto of the Inferno, as Dante is traveling through hell, he comes through the circle that was reserved for usurers. Right? And Dante says that the punishment for the usurers was to have this insatiable itch. They just couldn't get, they would scratch here, scratch there, according to Dante, like a dog afflicted with fleas. And then Dante doesn't identify the usurers that he sees. He came across three of them. But he does identify their coat of arms. Supposedly these usurers had money bags around their neck, and on the money bags were their coat of arms. So by simply telling us what he saw, of course, an audience would know exactly who he was that it saw, because they would know to which family the coat of arms pertained. And one of the usurers had a money bag on which was a big white pig, because the Italian word for big white pig or sow is scrofa, S-C-R-O-F-A, which is the root of the name Scrovegni. It is not the most noble symbol for a family to have, but it was the symbol that the Scrovegni family had. So by identifying the big fat white pig, Dante is saying that there's a Scrovegni here in the circle of hell reserved for users. And then the guy speaks. The guy with the white pig, the Scrovegni guy, says, "Here I sit, one Paduan." So he actually identifies his town at this point. Bam, it is a certain identification of this man. So the idea is it's really not great PR for a business to have its CEO and founder identified in hell, placed in hell at the time. So most of the time when you read up on the Scrovegni Chapel, what you read is that this is an instance where Junior Enrico, the guy you're looking at right now, is trying to make up for, is trying to expiate for his, excuse me, everyone, for his father's sins. That is the usual explanation that's given. Now, folks, that's a great story to tell, but there is a fundamental problem with that story. And that is that the date I showed you for the chapel is 1303. The earliest publication date for Dante's Inferno was 1314. So how could the chapel have been a reaction to the Inferno? I'm inclined to think that it was the other way around. I'm inclined to think that when Dante visited Padua, now if you don't know, in 1302, Dante was exiled from his native city of Florence over some political differences. I'm not going to get into that right now. But one of the places he went to was Padua. And he probably went to Padua because his good friend Giotto was painting there. Giotto and Dante were very good friends. They were exact contemporaries as well. And the impression that I've always had is that Dante walks into this chapel, sees how decorated, how sumptuous it is by 14th century standards, and this Scrovegni guy must have been a really nasty guy if he's looking to publicly amend his sins the way he is here. So maybe just seeing the chapel is what motivated Dante to actually include Enrico Scrovegni in hell. Now, another interesting anecdote comes out of Dante's visit to the Scrovegni Chapel. They were good friends, Giotto and Dante. And in addition to being, in my opinion, one of the top 3 painters of all time, Giotto, we're told, was also a virile man. He was the father of something like 7 or 8 children. And the story goes that one day when Giotto was up painting the figures on the walls, Dante was down below admiring his work, and he asked Giotto why his painted figures were all so beautiful, but his children all so ugly. To which Giotto responded, "Well, I paint my figures by day and I make my children by night." Folks, this is not the kind of dialogue one would expect from 2 of the greatest artists of all time. You expect them to speak with British accents, using, big, lofty 10-letter words and what have you. But instead, we get this kind of bar slang thrown back and forth between them. Now, whether or not this exchange actually took place, I don't care. But I think the message, the meaning behind the anecdote is that these 2 men, despite how extraordinary they were as artists, were fundamentally just regular guys. And that regular guy angle shows through in the way that Giotto paints these religious subjects, but also in the way that Dante Alighieri writes. Remember, Dante was the first to write in the vernacular, in the commonly spoken language, not in ecclesiastical Latin as everyone did. So, sometimes people say they're dumbing it down. They're not dumbing it down. What they're doing, what Giotto was doing in religious painting and what Dante is doing in literature, is vernacularizing. And that means that they are popularizing. You follow? They're making it more accessible to the general public. Not making it easier per se, it's just making it comprehensible at this particular point in time. And that's what we're going to see in the Scrovegni Chapel in just a sec. So here is a kind of breakdown of the subject matter of the actual frescoes on the wall. So you can start, again, up here. So you say Joachim's life. Joachim, if you don't know, was the father of the Virgin Mary. When in reality, scenes 1 through 12, we read them this way, left to right, all the way around, are actually all scenes from the life of the Virgin, okay? Because, of course, we wouldn't care about Joachim unless he were the dad of the Virgin Mary. And then here, 17 all the way through 27 represent scenes from the life and mission of Jesus Christ, the life and mission of Jesus Christ. And then the scenes from 29 all the way to 39 on the other side are scenes from the passion of Jesus Christ. Right? And in fact, 54, I told you, and you saw just a moment ago, it was the last judgment. And then we have, you can see they're numbered 40 to 53, these allegorical figures of vices and virtues as well. It's an incredibly rich program. And by the way, if you look, you'll notice that the windows here, right, which of course are not painted, these are openings, correspond to the flat bands that you see on the other side, but they don't line up perfectly, right? You'd imagine almost that the band would be right there, so that the space here would be equal to the space on the other side. But instead, the reason we have unpainted, at least figuratively speaking, wall on this side is because of the windows that are located on the other side instead. Okay, but let's now let the paintings do the talking. I like to refer to the fresco cycle in the Scrovegni Chapel as the first ever motion picture. Giotto, the artist, is celebrated because in a world where painting was still fundamentally Byzantine in style, okay, in the sense that pictorial images were usually flat, were very abstract, were emotionless as well, because the subject matter was always divine. And so, of course, the philosophy of the Byzantine artists was that if they were to make their paintings look like the real world, the audience would look at the painting and say, what's the big deal? You know, she looks like my mom. That looks like my house. This looks like my dog. And it would lose that sense of mystique, that sense of mystery or what have you. And that's what painting looked like for the better part of 700 years, until this guy, Giotto, comes along and starts putting the drama, the psychology, the emotion, the movement back in. But add to that, and for me, this is the most extraordinary thing. Giotto has surprisingly included what we would call cinematic aspects also. Now, I know that sounds absurd because there's no way that Giotto will ever know that one day you can actually line up pictures and show them in rapid sequence to create what we call a movie, a motion picture, but that's exactly what he does. And you know, I like to call him, Giotto, the Hitchcock of the 14th century, because nobody, and actually not even Hitch himself, who I'm a big fan of, tells a story like Giotto does. But again, let's let the frescoes do the talking. Scene number one, the expulsion of Joachim. So the legend regarding the Virgin Mary is that her parents, who were named Joachim and Anne, were quite old and were without child. And in their Judaic culture, this was seen as a punishment imposed upon them by God. In other words, they must have done something bad for which they're being punished by not being able to have a child. But Joachim would frequent temple week after week, offering sacrifice in hopes of being rewarded with a child. Right? And the story goes that after years of doing this, the priest at the temple, who you see right here, says, basta, enough. Clearly, God is not heeding your offering and your sacrifice. And so he expels Joachim. He kicks him out of the temple. That's what's happening here, the expulsion of Joachim. Now, it looks like the priest has been to bouncer school. Look at the way he twists the arm, grabs Joachim's robe, and is literally escorting him off of the premises. Joachim, who we know is old by the inclusion of white hair and white beard, which I know to us in the 21st century is the most obvious thing in the world. But no one before Giotto thought to suggest age, advanced age, by white hair and white beard. We're seeing it here for the first time. That little lamb that he's holding, who he brought to actually sacrifice, instead becomes his security blanket now as he clings to it. And look at that expression of distress on his face as he's being pushed off. Now, you look at the architecture and say, well, that's not the most sophisticated architectural setting, but he's doing it on purpose. Because remember, in Judeo society, if you are cut off from the temple, then you are a pariah. you're cut off from your very society. So the idea is once he steps off, he's in this social vacuum. He's nowhere. And to really twist the dagger, if you will, to really add salt to the wound, while poor old Joachim is saying, or being said bye-bye to, look what's happening inside. This younger man, and we know he's younger because he's got a full head of brown hair, is receiving a blessing because in all likelihood, he just told the priest that his wife is expecting. All right. So the idea of, some of us are more fortunate, others of us less so instead. And if this were a movie, I mean, if we're sitting back right now munching on the popcorn, in my mind, the music that would be playing would be that dramatic film noir cello music, right? I mean, rather sad, ominous opening to the story. And the next scene in the movie is Joachim going out into the wilderness. The scene's right next to the one that I just showed you. Now, when I'm teaching this with my undergrads, and I ask, can any of you please describe to me Joachim's emotional state? And immediately, depressed, dejected, down in the dumps. I mean, clearly he's sad. And the reason we know he's sad is because of his body language. So Giotto is employing actors like we employ in an actual movie. You see the way he's hugging himself, which is this most primitive of gestures that we perform. He's completely oblivious to everything that's going on. Look at little Fido, who's barking away, happy as can be to see his master. But you can see that Joachim is clearly not aware, oblivious to his celebrations. And we know that Joachim is not normally like this, everyone, because look at the expression on the face of this guy. Now, this is something that we still do today in the 21st century, and that is to shoot the look, as the expression goes. In other words, these are probably two shepherds employed by Joachim, who's normally a fun-loving, happy guy, and they walk up to him, but they can clearly sense that something is wrong. So one guy just looks out of the corner of his eye at the other guy, and you can almost imagine him thinking, what's up with him? Folks, the fact that I can, interpret that gesture in a 21st century the fact that we still do that I just did this earlier this morning when my kid was doing something crazy and I look at my wife out of the corner of my eye and she knows exactly what's going on. It is nonverbal communication. And the fact that Giotto was able to include it in his artwork is simply extraordinary. 1303. Most artists are struggling to make people look like people. And this guy, Giotto, is employing nonverbal communication in his artwork. Now, if this were the movie, by the way, suddenly some text would appear at the bottom. There'd be a caption across the bottom of the screen, which would read, "Meanwhile, back in Nazareth." Because remember, folks, there is another protagonist to the story, and that protagonist's name is Saint Anne. And while her husband was away, first at the temple, now in the wilderness, she is doing what all virtuous women should do, and that is spinning yarn. You see the yarn spinner over here? Now, this is a tradition that goes back even to classical mythology. Think of Penelope weaving her tapestry, then unweaving it at night. The idea is it kept them occupied away from sin. If you're wondering what the inside of a well-to-do 14th century home looked like, look no further, because their lives were much less cluttered than ours are today. So you have a bed, and by the way, the bedspread that you see, which will be appearing again later on, you see the little chest where they would keep their linens and clothes and things like this as well. The bench for sitting, not much else. You really don't need much else. We're the consumer society that just likes to fill our houses with junk. And while Anne is at home, an angel flies through her window and announces to her that she is going to have a child. So the Annunciation to Saint Anne. Now, technically speaking, that's it. I mean, we could move to the next scene, right? Because she just found out she's going to have a kid. If not for the fact that Giotto has included this female figure that you see, right? She serves no purpose at all regarding the narrative. In other words, he fulfilled the narrative scope, and that is what's supposed to be taking place. We don't know who she is. She's younger. She's outside. She could be a niece. She could be a maid. She's spinning yarn, which apparently means that she is virtuous. But if you look carefully at her face, she's stopped mid-gesture so she can turn her eyes towards the door and try to get a little bit of what's going on. She knows Anne is in there by herself. So who the hell is she talking to in there? The idea of adding this eavesdropper into the painting is extraordinary because what it is commentary on the human condition. And folks, we are all nosy creatures. Humans love to know other people's business, and Giotto shows that to us in this figure that he's inserted. Again, she serves no role in the overall sequence of the narrative, but what it does is to add color to the scene and, of course, reinforce the idea that it looks less like a divine narrative and much more like a human narrative instead. Okay, so you're reading the screenplay. You are all the movie directors, right? You're out there on the West Coast with all the glitz and glam of Hollywood. And Joachim's out in the country, dejected. Okay? Now, I've left out a scene, and the scene, I can't show them all because we'll be here all day. He pulls himself together and goes to bed. And in his sleep, he has a dream in which he's told that he's going to have a child. Right? So Joseph finds out he's going to have a kid in a dream. He's out in the country. And as you already know, just found out that she is going to have a child and she's at home. Now, in the days before cell phones, right, where we can't, honey, come home, I'm going to have a child, news would have to be exchanged in person. So this is the scene that every Hollywood director is hoping for. Joachim in the countryside and in the city, they are going to run as fast as their legs will take them to share this exciting news that they've been waiting their entire collective life to hear. And so when they finally meet, the slow-mo chariots of fire music playing in the background, beards and hair and everything else flying in the wind, what do they do? Well, the most logical, of course, of gestures, and that is to embrace and to kiss. The name of the scene is the meeting at the Golden Gate. We are suddenly in Jerusalem. We've left Nazareth somehow. We're in, but that's okay. And you can see Joachim and Anne, who are engaged in this embrace and in this rather intense, passionate kiss, which, by the way, is the seminal kiss in the history of visual arts. Right? If any of you are fans of Klimt and his kiss, if any of you are fans of Canova and his Jupiter, and not Jupiter, Cupid and Psyche, if any of you are fans of Picasso's kiss, if any of you are fans of Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, all of it goes back to the scene that you're looking at right now. No one had ever thought to show two figures engaged in a passionate kiss before the artist that you're looking at right now. And I'm talking about all the way to antiquity. I'm talking all the way back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. It's astonishing to think that this is the beginning, technically, of the next 7 centuries or so of pictorial and celebrated iconographic kiss images. Now, more than that, how about the fact that it's their two bodies that kind of come together? His right arm, see that? Her left arm, right here. His right eye, her left eye, his nose, their mouth. In other words, they seem to mesh into a single being. And what is the message of procreation, if not the fact that two people become one person? And we see it happening here right in front of us. Excuse me, my mouse is going crazy. So there they are. The music in the background is celebratory music. Look at the women who are just bubbly, who are just beside themselves in enthusiasm for what is going on. You can see their facial expressions. Consider Giotto was the first to introduce facial expressions communicating emotions as well. There is joy in Mudville this day. Look at the bright blue skies. It's sunny. I mean, everything's great. But then suddenly, if I'm the movie director of this particular scene, I would close in on this female figure here with the black robe, and the music would suddenly change to dun, dun, dun. because clearly she has some kind of ominous, foreboding meaning in this painting. And what she's doing is simply reminding us that as happy as this story is going to get, and it's going to get absolutely ecstatic at certain moments, it is ultimately a tragedy because it ends with a man nailed to a tree. And so the fact that Giotto is employing visual foreshadowing is nothing less than stunning. Because again, most artists in the 14th century don't even know what foreshadowing is. Right? Now, is this painting as extraordinary as I make it out to be? Well, I want you to realize that one of Giotto's assistants, who also happened to be his godson, he was a painter by the name of Taddeo Gaddi, 30 years after this painting, was asked to paint the same scene in the Church of Santa Croce in Florence. Right? And the story goes that before Gaddi showed the two of them kissing, he wasn't sure it was appropriate, so he wrote a letter to the Archbishop of Florence asking permission. We actually still have the letter. I'm paraphrasing, but the gist of it is, "Dear Archbishop, I have to paint a meeting at the Golden Gate, and in Padua, my teacher showed Saints Joachim and Anne kissing. I was wondering if it was okay if I were to do the same." The bishop wrote back and said, absolutely not, essentially suggesting that to show these two saints kissing is roughly the equivalent of showing the two of them fornicating. So instead of showing Saints Joachim and Anne hugging and kissing to celebrate this joyous moment, what we have in Taddeo Gaddi's interpretation of the story is the two saints rubbing elbows and bumping halos with each other in the center of the scene. You see it right there. I say it, of course, for comic relief, but people say, well, how come then Giotto got away with it? Well, Giotto was the kind of personality who did it first and then asked for forgiveness if he had to later. Gaddi was the kind of guy who asked for permission first and never got it done. B, in Giotto's story, it seems like such a human story. We kind of forget about those halos, don't we? I mean, we don't really think about it. I don't, at least personally, think as this story of divine and religious figures, whereas here, obviously, by doing this, it kind of lends to that kind of divinity of the actual scene. But I just want to illustrate how exceptional, and I mean exceptional in the literal sense, how Giotto's paintings really do represent the exception to the general rule at the time. Okay, now begins what I believe to be the most entertaining series of scenes in the history of art. And it has to do with Mary growing up and becoming so beautiful and so virtuous that every young man in Nazareth wanted her hand in marriage. The question, of course, is which one of them deserved her? The priests at the temple got involved and essentially announced to all of her potential suitors that they should present themselves at temple with rods, R-O-D-S, with sticks. Right? These sticks would be collected, would be blessed, and then whichever of the sticks distinguished itself from the others would clearly mean that God, because God was going to choose the husband of the Virgin Mary, that God was signaling the bearer of the rod to be her husband. Right? So Giotto painting this story in three scenes. The first of which you're looking at right now, the presentation of the rod. So look at these young men. They're all beardless. They all have full heads of brown hair, and they are all presenting their rods and or sticks to the priest right there. Story goes that there's one guy in Nazareth who's considerably older than all of these men, considerably older than the Virgin herself. His name is Joseph, and you can see him over here. We know he's older than everyone else because he has that salt and pepper thing going. You see that? He has the halo as well, so we obviously know he's destined for great things, and you can see him holding his rod. Problem was, he was not sure if he should participate because he felt a bit foolish. Right? So here we see the presentation of the rods. The next scene that Giotto paints is the watching of the rods. Right? See the priests down here? There's the big pile of rods and or sticks. Here are all the young men down in the trenches waiting for something to happen, waiting for that divine sign. And here we can see Joseph, who, according to the story, ultimately did not present his rod, but remained at the back of the temple, and I'm quoting here, with his rod in hand, when it suddenly burst forth into bloom. We're told that lilies popped out of the top of Joseph's rod, and doves descended from the sky and landed upon it, when obviously everyone realized that he was the man predestined to win the hand of the Virgin Mary. And so you can see here the marriage of the Virgin, where Joseph is holding his magic rod. It's now been transformed into a lily. You can see the dove that I mentioned before as he slips a wedding ring onto the hand of the Virgin Mary. And all of the other suitors here protesting. Look at this guy crying foul. He wants to take a closer look at that rod, make sure there's nothing amiss. This guy breaking the rod on his knee, and you can interpret that however you like. Now, here's the interesting thing, everyone. The humor of this particular story was not lost on a 14th century audience. Okay? The same guy who painted the bumping halos painting that I showed you a moment ago paints the same scene, the marriage of the Virgin, in the same place in Santa Croce. Here's Joseph, there's the magic rod, there's the dove. Excuse me, you see him putting the wedding ring on Mary's hand. You see the guy here breaking the stick, this guy about to whack Joseph in anger. But arguably the funniest figure that you will ever see in the history of art, in the lower left-hand corner of this fresco, this man in yellow who has shown up to the competition with nothing less than a sapling upon his shoulder. And clearly the message being, it is not the size of the rod that counts, it is instead the magical properties. And folks, again, that humor was not lost on a 14th century audience, because there's no other reason to put that figure in the particular scene. All right, another of Giotto's exceptional scenes from the Scrovegni is the wedding feast at Cana, which, if you don't know, was Jesus's first public miracle, where he turned water into wine. There's Jesus telling the servants to pour water into the empty containers of wine, and that's essentially what's happening over here. And the interesting thing is the humor, because this large, jolly fellow that you actually see is the wine taster. And of course, that big bulbous belly of the wine taster juxtaposed against the big bulbous belly of the wine containers. In other words, this is a large container of wine, as is the belly that you see there. This guy, Giotto, has room for humor in his paintings. Again, when most of the time artists were not thinking about humor at all. Here's a close-up of the wine taster. I call him the Norm Peterson of the 14th century. If any of you are fans of the old television series Cheers, you know what I'm talking about. And it has been proposed, right, that this might be a self-portrait of Giotto. Right? Now, folks, I'm not telling you I believe it, because there's just no way to prove it one way or another. We can't prove excuse me, or disprove that this is Giotto, because there are no known portraits of the artist. But off the record, I would not be surprised, because I've always imagined Giotto, the artist, as being a fun guy to hang out with, and this guy gives me that exact same impression as well. Okay, we move to a few more of these scenes. This one, the raising of Lazarus, right? Now, you think most of you know, this is the miracle that Jesus performed when he brought his good friend Lazarus back from the dead after having been dead for a full 4 days. And in fact, I personally maintain that it's at this particular event that the exclamation, Jesus Christ, came into existence, right? In other words, when Jesus goes to the tomb and he orders the tomb slab to be moved, remember, he's been dead for 4 days. I think the guy next to Jesus says, Jesus Christ, he's been in there for 4 days. Fearful, of course, of what the stench would be once that slab was moved. And you can see the figures here covering their noses. This is an exceptional thing as well, everyone. It's one of the most complex things for any artist to achieve, regardless of the medium. And that is what we call the interchangeability of the senses. That is, evoking an alternate sense by stimulating a certain sense. In other words, by looking at this painting, I can stimulate olfactory, smell, because in the 14th century, people would have been much more familiar with the smell of a rotting body. By hearing a piece of music, I get a feeling. By feeling something, I can taste it. You follow? Mixing, switching, if you will, between those senses, which is an extremely complex thing that clearly Giotto is able to do in the early 14th century. Or his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. This is Palm Sunday. This is when Jesus and the apostles enter into Jerusalem and they're welcomed like kings. Look at the figures right here, 1, 2, and 3. And I want you to note what Giotto is attempting to do. 3 figures in distinct stages of a single action, and that is removing the robe, right? They're laying the robes on the ground so Christ's mule's hooves don't touch it. Here's a close-up. This figure pulling the robe off his sleeve, this figure with the green robes kind of caught on the head, this figure laying the robe down on the ground. If we were to read this in sequence, everyone, you're looking at a single action performed by 3 different figures. And as far as I know, this is the earliest attempt at animation in the history of art, perhaps in the history of the visual arts in general. And I can prove to you that that's what he's trying to do, because a few years later, Giotto would do it again in another fresco in another place. Most artists are struggling to make people look like people. Giotto is flirting with animation in his works. Right? My favorite scene, what I believe to be the most dramatic in the entire Scrovegni Chapel, and that, of course, is the kiss. Think of this from, again, cinematic perspective. It's such a dramatic moment. Jesus and the apostles up on Gethsemane. The silence, which is violated. When you look at this scene, I think you get that sense of violation because it must have been just dead still, maybe with just some crickets chirping in the background. Now instead, trumpets sounding, spears rattling, people shouting, just this general commotion. And then all of it just kind of magically disappears in this grouping of the 2 figures that you see here of Jesus Christ, who's engulfed by the traitor Judas, and the way they stare into each other's eyes and that profound meaning of betrayal. And I still remember looking at this painting for the first time ever back in the early 1990s and immediately thinking how similar it looked to one of the most celebrated scenes in the history of cinema. And that, of course, is the great kiss between Michael and Fredo Corleone in Godfather 2. Now, me, suggesting that Francis Ford Coppola looked at Giotto before he filmed The Godfather is probably hyperbole. But the fact that I can compare a 14th century fresco on the left of your screen to a 20th century film on the right is a pretty extraordinary thing and reflective as to how ahead of the game Giotto actually was. The lamentation, and you can see Christ here in the arms of his mother, Mary Magdalene by his feet. Look how the landscape draws your eye down to this duo down below. Look at the angels and the emotion that they demonstrate here over the death of Jesus Christ. All of it incredibly powerful. But what I want to show you is this. The next scene is the resurrection, right? And so you can see the empty tomb. There's Jesus, Mary Magdalene reaching for him, and Christ says, "Touch me not, I'm not yet clean." That's what the title means. Noli me tangere is simply Latin for touch me not. Well, let's do that again. Look at the landscape here. I said it comes down, but if we were to read it lower left to upper right, the next scene, you see it starts in the upper left and comes down to the right. Watch this, everyone. I find this just spectacular. The landscape disappears behind the border and then comes down. And if that's not impressive enough, what if I start down here, follow that rock up, and notice that it lines up with the mountain that you have up there as well. I mean, juxtaposing the landscapes or even the subject matter. So next to the wedding feast at Cana over here on the right, we have Moses drawing water from the rock. Next to the raising of Lazarus, we have God creating Adam. Next to the lamentation, just before Jesus' body was put into the tomb, we have Jonah disappearing into the belly of the whale. I could spend the rest of your week pulling this chapel apart, everyone. It is just absolutely astounding. And again, it is the defining one. If you've never seen it before and are wondering, how come I've never heard or seen the Scrovegni Chapel? The reason, everyone, is very simply because it's not located in Florence. It's not located in Rome. It is not located in Venice, which are, of course, the three primary touristic destinations. If it were, then in my opinion, it would be as popular and as celebrated as the Sistine Chapel is today. All right, but let us leave now the Scrovegni Chapel and let us head to Florence to our next chapel, located in this 13th century church called Santa Maria del Carmine. It is the seat of the Carmelite order, or the followers of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. That is the official name. Now, I want you to realize something. This chapel that we're talking about, okay, which looks like this, is located inside the church, but it is separated. It is cordoned off from the rest of the church. So if you want to visit the church, then you walk through the front door during opening hours, okay, morning and afternoon. And you can see the church, but you can't see the chapel. If you want to see the chapel, then you go through this door, through the cloister, through the back door, and then into the chapel. And you can see the chapel, but you can't see the church. They keep the two things separate, technically speaking. And the Brancacci Chapel, which was a funerary chapel owned by a Florentine family named Brancacci, was actually decorated by three different painters. The first of which was a guy named Mazzolino. Now, Mazzolino was painting in the 1400s, but was what we call an international style or international Gothic style painter. Right? What that means is that he's not fully Renaissance. We also call the international style the late Gothic because there's still very much that's Gothic about it. Masaccio, who was his partner professionally, okay, much younger. And in fact, Masaccio, who I like to call, excuse me, the James Dean of the Renaissance, because he dies at the ripe old age of 27, was painting in this chapel when he was in his early 20s, which is phenomenal. Now, neither of these two guys complete the frescoes. So 50 years later, this guy named Filippino Lippi comes in to complete them. Now, keep in mind that Filippino, the third guy, was the son of a Carmelite friar named Fra Lippo Lippi, who was a priest at this church. And if that's not enough tabloid information for you, how about the fact that this guy, Filippino Lippi's mother, was a nun? So he's the son of a priest and a nun. And he goes back to the church where his father was a priest to complete the fresco cycle that you see. Now, we're not going to focus on the tabloid stuff. We'll leave that to social media. We instead will focus on what a revolution Masaccio was. Because there's no better place in the world to teach the transition of Gothic painting to Renaissance painting than in the chapel of the Brancacci in the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine. So look at the left. So the image of Adam and Eve, painted by this guy Mazzolino, at the same time as the one on the right. But when you look on the left-hand side, you know, what are the characteristics of this international Gothic style? Well, how about the fact that the two of them look like they're free-floating in space, right? Not firmly planted on the ground. That their nudity is Barbie doll-ish, if you get my drift. In other words, all of the necessary body parts are there, but there's no real attention to anatomy in them. Their faces, if we were to clean shave both of them, you'd find that their faces are identical. What differentiates them is the short haircut and the beard here versus the longer George Washington wig-like haircut that you have over there instead. Oh, and by the way, lest I forget, in Italy, the forbidden fruit is not the apple, it's the fig, and it's quite common to see the head of the serpent represented as the head of a female. Now compare that to what's going on the right. Masaccio, a 23-year-old kid when he paints this, revolutionizing the world of art history. Look at the way his figure's feet are firmly planted on the ground. Look how their physical reality, their substance, is reinforced by the use of shadow, right? And the idea that, of course, only solid things can obstruct light and produce shadow. Look at the chiaroscuro, that light-dark contrast that he's using to articulate the anatomy through the abdomen, the rib cage, the shoulders, the quads, the calves of the figure. Look at the emotion of Adam's face under those hands. You can see the mouth pulling back, the cringing eyes. Look at that blonde mop of hair. In fact, one art historian summed it up perfectly when he said that the difference between these two artists is that the guy on the left paints hairs, whereas the guy on the right paints hair. And that's why we use a collective term to describe it, because we don't see strands. We don't see that wig-like texture that you see there instead. Look at Eve, everyone. And I remember looking at that figure of Eve for the first time in the late 1990s and immediately thinking how similar she looked to the celebrated expressionistic piece called The Scream, where essentially we can't even talk about naturalism anymore because her despondent state has overridden her physical reality. Her face becomes a mask of horror comparable to that face that you see over there. Look at her breast compressing under the pressure of her right hand. I mean, the naturalism of it is simply astounding. Again, at a time when artists were still quite limited in terms of what they're able to achieve. But of all the scenes in the Brancacci Chapel, this is the one that usually receives the most attention, and that is the so-called tribute money. Jesus and the apostles visiting a town called Capernaum, where they are confronted by a gateskeeper. Here's Jesus, here are the apostles, here's the gateskeeper. Gateskeeper says, you want to come in, you must pay a tax. All the apostles look at Jesus and say, ooh, is Jesus going to pay tax just like the rest of us mortals? Jesus saves the day by telling Peter, who's right here, to go to a nearby lake to fish a fish from the lake, in the mouth of which he'll find the exact amount of money that he then needs to pay the gateskeeper over here on the right-hand side to get it. All right. Now, we are on the cusp of the Renaissance, and the reason we know that is because already you could see Masaccio employing linear or single point perspective in the scene. Look at these lines. Pulling your eyes to the vanishing point, which is located there at the head of Jesus Christ. That is where, or from where we're seeing the scene. Along the horizon line, which is where the foreground meets the background. And so the foreground essentially composed of all the figures, the background instead by that landscape that you see. And if you're keeping score at home, everyone, the single greatest contribution of the Renaissance to the history of art was the development of linear or single point perspective. All right. It now allowed artists to determine how their works were seen. As one art historian put it very eloquently, with the advent of linear perspective, it is no longer you looking at the painting, it is now the painting looking at you. And this 23-year-old kid was one of the first to employ it here as well. But there's something about the tribute money. You know, in addition to the naturalism of all the faces, to the halos that are in perspective, the feet firmly planted, the shadows that they cast, the spontaneity of it all, that prevents it from being celebrated as the first ever painting of the Renaissance. And that is the fact that Peter appears in the same scene once, twice, thrice. And of course, you can't do that. This defies the rules of physics, where objects can only occupy one space at one time. Look, the gateskeeper over here and the gateskeeper over there. So again, the cusp of the Renaissance, because everything about this is Renaissance except for the fact that it defies physics. Right? Let's now look at the two scenes to the left and right here of the window. The one on the left, painted by Masolino, the older Gothic style painter, and it's the image of St. Peter preaching. Look how Peter floats. Look how his halo, you can see the older guy is trying to pick up on the innovations of the younger guy. So he wants to do that, just the distorted halo thing, but doesn't it look like the halo is sliding off of Peter's head over here on the left-hand side? Or how about the B-class actors? Yeah, I guess St. Peter must have been at it for a while because everyone's kind of dozing off. But to show their fatigue, he kind of overemphasizes. He kind of does stuff like this instead. It looks, to use a very sophisticated adjective, cheesy, as my students like to say. Look on the right instead. The spontaneity of the baptism of the neophytes. Peter standing next to the river. Look at the musculature of this figure kneeling. The hair. So, you know, artists having difficulty painting hair, Masaccio has already graduated to the illusion of wet hair. Water flowing over the locks and loosening them. My favorite figure in the whole chapel is this guy standing there in his tighty whiteys, freezing waiting his turn. You can almost hear him mumbling, oh, I hope this guy hurries up. But he's not looking at us in performing the action. He's simply performing. So the idea, again, of spontaneity in the work as the figures in the background either robe or disrobe in preparation of or leaving the actual baptism that's taking place up front. The next scene is down here on the left-hand side. Okay? And this is actually kind of a composite. It's called the raising of the son of Theophilus. The story goes that Peter shows up in Theophilus in part of the world. Peter shows up in a city called Antioch in a part of the world called Syria. The king was a guy named Theophilus, whose son had been dead for several years. But hearing about Peter's miraculous abilities, the king says, is there anything you can do? Peter goes to the place where this kid has been buried and brings him back to life. You can see him right there. Now, I said that this is a bit of a pastiche, because what you have is that later artist, Filippino Lippi, painting these five guys, and then Masaccio painting all these figures up to the guy in green, and then the later artist painting all these figures, and then Masaccio painting all the figures that you see to the right-hand side. And the specific group that I want to show you is over here on the right, because it is with Masaccio. See the big guy looking up out at you here? Folks, that is a self-portrait of the painter. He puts himself in the scene on the right-hand side. And so later on, it becomes quite normal for artists, for painters in particular, to include their own self-portraits on the far right-hand side of a painting. It starts here with Masaccio, and here's a close-up of his face. Here's his partner, the older guy. By the way, their names are both nicknames, okay? Both Mazzolino and Masaccio are nicknames for Tommaso or Thomas. Mazzolino means little Tom. And I think you can see he has a rather diminutive stature here. Masaccio means big Tom, and he kind of towers above everyone else. This guy, you may have heard of, his name is Leon Battista Alberti. He's one of the greatest theoretical minds of the Renaissance. And the guy behind them with the black hood is none other than my guy, Filippo Brunelleschi, the guy who built the dome on Florence Cathedral. And the great thing is that when you turn the corner, the scene over here, which is an image of Saint, oops, oh boy, what did I just do? Folks, I'm going to stop my share for 1 sec. There we are. All right, sorry about that. The scene that you see over here to the right-hand side, oops, which is Saint Peter healing with his shadow. Not much explaining to do. He simply walks by and can heal. Look at the realism of the cripples that you have here down below. But more importantly, this guy with the blue smock and the folded hands is in fact a portrait of Donatello. And if you don't know, Donatello was the inventor of Renaissance sculpture. So if I go back, Masaccio, the inventor of Renaissance painting, Brunelleschi, the inventor of Renaissance architecture, and then in the scene here on the corner, we have Donatello, the inventor of Renaissance sculpture. The big three. I like to call them the Rat Pack of the Renaissance, because each was responsible for inventing their own particular field, if you will, in the history of art, which is extraordinary. All right. Okay, let's keep moving now. Where am I? Here I am. Because our next chapel is a doozy. And I'm fairly certain that a majority of you have heard about it. The so-called Sistine Chapel, named after its patron, who was Pope Sixtus IV. Okay, so let's clear this up once and for all, everyone. The chapel is the Sistine Chapel. It is not the 16th chapel. There is no 15th and there is no 17th chapel anywhere in Vatican City. Chapel in Italian is cappella. It is a feminine noun. And because it was a cappella built by a pope named Sisto, which is Italian for Sixtus, Sisto is a masculine name. So to make it feminine, Sisto becomes Sistina to agree with the chapel, the Cappella Sistina. That's where the name actually comes from. Now, I want you to notice the date. This chapel was built a full 35 years before Michelangelo ever painted the ceiling inside. So the chapel actually predates Michelangelo. Here is a 19th century theoretical engraving of what the chapel may have looked like before Michelangelo came along. And if you look up at the ceiling, you'll notice this pattern of golden stars. So again, more than likely, blue paint with gold stars. This is the before photo. Excuse me. This is the after photo. And I dare say a rather significant improvement to the chapel. All right. Michelangelo signing the contract for the Sistine Chapel ceiling on May 10th of the year 1508. He was 33 years old. We're talking about 6,000 square feet of ceiling surface that needs to be covered with decoration. Now, if you've been in there, then you know it's nearly impossible to take it all in at once. In fact, I've been into the chapel, I don't know, dozens and dozens and dozens of times, and every single time I go in, I focus on one specific part of the chapel because I know that it is simply overwhelming. There's too much going on up there. So first thing we need to do is to break down the imagery and the iconography. The 9 main scenes run through the central spine of the ceiling. They start down here and they make their way up that way. Let me back up. Start right here. This is the separation of light from darkness, sun and the moon, separation of the domes, creation of Adam, creation of Eve. Let me go now to that schematic. See it here? So small, big in scale. 3 scenes showing God creating, 3 scenes showing A&E, as I like to call them, Adam and Eve, and then 3 scenes focusing on Noah. All 9 from the Old Testament book of Genesis. Then between the triangular spandrels, you see names like Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, Isaiah. These are, of course, Old Testament prophets. And then the remaining names, the Persian Sibyl, the Cumaean Sibyl, the Erythraean Sibyl, the Delphic Sibyl. If you don't know, a Sibyl is a fortune teller, is a soothsayer. In the ancient pagan world, they were able to foretell upcoming things. They were fortune tellers per se. And the reason they're painted up here is because tradition maintains that they had also foreseen the coming of Jesus Christ. Then these names, we'll see these as well, representing the ancestors of Jesus as identified in the Gospel of Matthew, the 3 sets of 14 generations that connect Jesus all the way back to Abraham. And then in the corners, you can see more Old Testament stories of David and Goliath, Judith and Holofernes, the death of Haman from the book of Esther, and Moses and the brazen serpent. Folks, I'm tired simply telling you the subject matter of what was painted up here. Can you imagine actually having to paint all of this? 6,000 square feet of ceiling painting by one man whose name was Michelangelo. Now, I hope that none of you are still under the impression that Michelangelo was lying on his back when he painted the ceiling. If you don't know, the reason most people do think he was lying on his back is because of a popular book from the 1960s called The Agony and the Ecstasy. The book was turned into a movie. Charlton Heston played Michelangelo. Was it Richard Harris? No, Rex Harrison. Rex Harrison played Pope Julius II instead. And of course, we see him there lying on his back. Folks, this letter, which is actually a poem written by Michelangelo, so if you want to know what his handwriting looked like, there you go, actually shows us that in reality, look down here in the lower right-hand corner, Michelangelo was standing up when he painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling. This is a doodle that he himself did, and he clearly illustrates to us that he was standing up with his right hand extended upward towards the ceiling, painting the figures that you see here. All right, folks, he would have been better off lying down. If any of you have ever had the pleasure of, when I say paint a ceiling, I don't mean painting it the way he did. I mean whitewashing. You know, working above your head is an incredibly uncomfortable thing. You can do it for a little bit, but of course then your muscles begin to wear. Michelangelo did it for 4.5 years over some 6,000 square feet. Whoa. Now, pardon the grainy quality of the image, but it's old. In fact, this is a photograph of the restorers when they were up there on the ceiling cleaning it in the 1980s and early 1990s. And the type of scaffolding that they employed was allegedly a recreation of what Michelangelo had used in the first place. So this tower is where the stairs are that would let you get up there. And then you have this bridge that actually span the entire width of the chapel, resting on what are steel beams. You see them? But of course, when Michelangelo did it, they would have been wooden beams instead, but the concept is the same. Now, here is a very rare image of Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Now, when I say that to my undergrads, there was always this moment of awkward hesitation. Folks, the gentleman that you're looking at is the recently deceased Pierluigi Colalucci. He was, in fact, the lead restorer of the ceiling back in the 80s and 90s. And I just love the picture because it's suggestive of what it would have looked like to have seen Michelangelo up there, actually at work on the frescoes. It also gives you an indication of the scale of the figures themselves, which you can tell are quite large. Right now, let's look at the entirety of it. So here's the first scene, separation of light from darkness, and then you move from this end to this end, okay? That's how you read the scenes. But Michelangelo painted them in the exact opposite direction. He started down here and worked towards the altar. Why? Well, because he had had relatively little experience running a painting workshop, and particularly on a project of this scale. So I think what Michelangelo was doing was kind of gambling that if he was going to produce less than extraordinary artwork, he wanted to do it down here. Because when you walk into a space, your inclination is never to look at your immediate surroundings. What you normally do is you look into a space. And so the idea that Michelangelo was presuming, of course, that he would get better as time went on. So the first of the scenes that he most likely painted, let me back up, is right here. It's a big one, meaning large in scale, and it shows us the universal flood. So this is the story of Noah and the ark, right? Now, notice that with Michelangelo, regardless of what it's supposed to be, his obsession was with one thing, and that was the male body, nude whenever possible. All of his artwork, whether it was sculpture or painting, was simply a pretense for him to showcase the male nude form, as you can see here. And that's what Michelangelo brings to the table. In many ways, he was the first true modern artist because he saw reality through a subjective lens, and that was through the male nude form. And you can see these refugees looking for high ground, but clearly they all become an opportunity for him to showcase the male nude form. Now, here's the next scene, which is the sacrifice of Noah. Notice that Noah's sons are all completely nude, but perhaps even more importantly, these four figures who frame the painting, this is one of the smaller ones, are simply there as decoration. Michelangelo celebrating the male nude form to the extent where he's employing it as a form of decoration now instead. And any one of these figures, we refer to them generically as ignudo, and ignudo translates as nude men. If you were to crop any of these figures, put it in a frame and put it in the Metropolitan Museum or the Getty Museum or wherever, it would be one of the most important works in the museum. But on the ceiling, it's there. Each one is one of 20. There are 20 of these things total throughout the entire space. And that's what I mean by the ceiling just being overwhelming, because each one of these is what we might classify as a masterpiece. Michelangelo envisioning the male nude form in any number of poses. And you see it there in all these various ignudi. This one, perhaps the most dramatic of all, twisting and turning, Michelangelo exploring the possibilities for showing the drama of the male body through the form that it actually takes. Now, here is the next scene. And the subject is the temptation and expulsion of Adam and Eve. Temptation on the left, expulsion on the right. Cause on the left, effect on the right. Look at Michelangelo's interpretation of the Garden of Eden, which consists of 3 boulders and a dead tree stump. Not going to waste time with detail, fluff, and landscape. What he cares about is the male nude form, even when it's female. Look at Eve's body. That's clearly a male anatomy that he's using here. There's the fig tree again. Here is the snake with the upper body of a woman. And here we have Adam and Eve who have been expelled. Just a little bit of green to suggest ground. The white is the natural white of the actual plaster. And then blue to suggest sky, not wasting his time with any kind of landscape. And in fact, if the figures of Adam and Eve look familiar, they should. Folks, we know for a fact that Michelangelo spent considerable time in the Brancacci Chapel looking at Masaccio's figures. And you can see the influence of Masaccio in Michelangelo's work. So the chapels, the Scrovegni, the Brancacci, and the Sistine are all connected in that sense. Here's the most celebrated of all the frescoes, right? Michelangelo's interpretation of the creation of Adam. Right? Now, folks, I wanted to just stop for a second and think about how the biblical version actually took place, because this isn't it. According to the book of Genesis, God created Adam by scooping up a bunch of clay, shaping that clay into his own image, and then breathing life into Adam's nostrils. That's what gave him soul, what animated, anima, animated him instead. Now, Michelangelo, sitting at home saying, how the hell am I going to show that? 2 fully grown men breathing life into each other's nostrils. So he completely reinvents the story. This lifeless figure of Adam waiting there on this cliff or on this hill. And here comes God, this embodiment of virility and power and energy and what have you as well. And you can already hear the zapping as their fingers come close together. And you know full well that once they touch, Adam will just jump up and start flying around like Superman or what have you. And the amazing thing about this scene is that if you were to just take a survey and ask 10 random people, how did God create Adam? I'm convinced that a majority of the people you ask think that the story happened this way. That is the way that Michelangelo portrayed it, that his version of the story supersedes the actual biblical version instead. Here, one of the prophets along the sides, as I mentioned before, any one of these is just overwhelmingly powerful and beautiful. In fact, the word awesome. Remember, when something is awesome, everyone, it is both inspirational and terrifying at the same time. And that is a great word for Michelangelo's figures. Look at this prophet, Daniel, sitting down as he twists. You can feel the power. He's writing something there with his right hand. The muscles, the colors that Michelangelo's combining in unprecedented ways. And then the imagination. Look at this guy carrying the book. This is what gets me. This almost limitless inspiration for figures. I call him the baby Atlas. My imagination is not that vast, not even close to what Michelangelo was able to do over and over again up on the ceiling. Here is the Libyan Sibyl, because she comes from the North African country of Libya. And she reminds me very much of a bodybuilder. Almost looks like she's posing to show us those muscles in the upper shoulders and arms and back as well. Power, control, and grace all at the same time. And that's what Michelangelo is imbuing his figures with. Here, opposite her, the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah, engaged in this kind of meditative thinking position as well. Hand brought up to his mouth, legs crossed, the unprecedented mixture of the yellow to the kind of fuchsia color combo. It's just extraordinary to behold. And another, masterpiece in its own right, but here blending in with the figures. And then down below, just below those triangular scenes in the prophets and sibyls, we have the so-called ancestors. We call them ancestors because the names that appear on the plaques are the names that are identified in the Gospel of Matthew as the ancestors of Jesus Christ. But these are both male names, the names of men. But clearly the figure over here is a woman. So what Michelangelo is depicting is clearly not what is indicated in the plaques. Almost as if these figures become caricatures. Kind of Michelangelo letting loose, if you will, here as well. And here's a detail of the face of the man that you see right here, just to give you an idea of what goes into the execution of these figures, because when you're close up, it all kind of dissolves, right? It kind of falls apart. But when you move away, look how it all kind of coalesces to create this incredibly convincing sculptural reality. Here's another of the lunettes with this incredibly warm image of a mother and a child cuddling over here using fictive architecture. Remember, there's nothing there. This is Michelangelo's illusion of the woman leaning up against that window frame. And then the comic juxtaposition of this old man looking at his dunce stick. You see that? But if we look, the head of the dunce stick is actually a portrait of the old man. He's looking back at himself. Now, folks, that's a detail that you can't really appreciate when you're standing in the chapel because that detail is just too small. So some say that maybe this is the area where Michelangelo was just letting loose, relaxing, painting for himself and giving himself a little bit of comic relief, considering how stressful the job the entire project must have been. Here's another of those lunettes where we have this figure. I love how he stares off blankly into space and then juxtapose this incredibly powerful female figure. Look at the size of her shoulders and arm. But if we isolate and simply show the comb running through her blonde hair, the delicacy, the femininity of it, for me is on par with any of Degas' ballet dancers or bathers or what have you instead. Again, Michelangelo, this dichotomy of figure, both grace and power at the same time. And lastly, I talked about the restoration on the ceiling. Folks, this is what it looked like up until the 1980s, covered with 2 layers of varnish and centuries of grime and candle black and dust and soot and what have you as well, so that this is instead how you see it today. And if you've seen the Sistine Chapel since it was restored, consider yourselves fortunate, because essentially you're seeing it the same way Michelangelo saw it when he died in 1564. And the Sistine Chapel ceiling is without doubt the most revolutionary painting of the Renaissance, because it takes all of the innovations introduced by the previous 2, Giotto's and Masaccios, and then now it incorporates it into this vast and epic scheme of figures in drama and motion, but most importantly, of an artistic vision of an individual. That this is how Michelangelo saw reality, laying the foundation for how we would all see reality for centuries to come. All right, folks, I'm going to wrap it up there. I know we want to leave some time for questions, so please, if you do have questions, feel free. Ava Marie, I think we're putting them in the Q&A feature.
Yes. So feel free. First of all, thank you. Much applause. Thank you. That was very compelling. If you have any questions, students, go right ahead and put them in the Q&A. But here's a couple to kind of get us started. You had mentioned in the very beginning, especially with the Scrovegni Chapel, how other families kind of just took over ancient rooms. Was there a process, or was it they could just say, hey, we like this, let's take it?
Pretty much. Remember, there was no kind of central authority in most of these places. It really was the rule of might. The Scrovegni family was the most prominent wealthy family in Padua, so they could pretty much do whatever they wanted. There's another analogous situation in Rome when I think it was the Orsini family actually built their palace in the center of the Colosseum, and the walls of the Colosseum served as the sort of protective walls around their home. They kind of took over the Colosseum as a fortress, per se, and there was nobody to stop them because they were one of the more important families in Rome at the time.
Right. Excellent. Here's another question. Do we have any letters or writings of Giotto?
No.
Nothing. Okay.
No, most of the information we have about Giotto is either hearsay or circumstantial. Dante mentions Giotto, doesn't tell us much about him. Giorgio Vasari, if you're not familiar with, I call him Uncle Giorgio, Zio Giorgio.
Yes.
I've had this book since I was in college. He tells us quite a bit about Giotto, but is writing 200 years, actually almost 250 years after the fact. But fortunately, Giotto was famous enough that there were contemporary, near contemporaries who did speak about him. So we're able to piece together certain parts of his life.
Sure. Hey, and then could you stop your screen share? We have people who would
Ooh,
actually like to see you.
oh, geez.
Excellent.
There you go.
There you go. Fantastic. Thank you. Well, did Giotto have a large workshop? Do we have any evidence of his workshop?
We don't have the evidence, but we really don't need to. It was just, again, customary at the time for artists to employ workshops, which could vary in size from one assistant to a half dozen per se. But considering how busy Giotto was, how prominent and in demand, we imagine that his workshop would have been one of the larger of the 14th century. Folks, actually, this is an important point. What I want you to realize is not having a workshop would have been exceptional. Michelangelo is the guy who starts running around saying that artisans employ workshops and that artists instead produce all their art autographically, mainly because he himself did not imply a workshop. So that's when we started to change our perception, and most of us like to imagine an artist sitting at his easel by himself with no heat, suffering, and what have you as well. That's all a kind of romantic construct that came out of Michelangelo's idea of the workshop not being part of an artist tradition.
Excellent. So here's a question that came in. Did Michelangelo use models for his paintings? Did he draw the paintings before he painted them on the ceiling?
His models were not the sort of current idea of a model. I think today, if any of you have ever been in an artist studio, it's very common to actually have nude models there posing for them. They didn't do that then. Now consider that in a workshop, it was very common for an apprentice to simply pose, not in the nude necessarily, but simply to give the artist a suggestion of movement in space. Kind of like today when you go to an art supply store, they have those mannequins, that artists use simply to see how an object extends itself in space. But also remember that Michelangelo spent considerable time at the quarries in Carrara, where he would have an almost limitless supply of muscular models. I mean, if you go to Carrara today and you go to the outdoor quarries in the summer, most of the quarrymen are shirtless. And they're big guys, they're under the sun. And, Michelangelo's, when you look at his drawings, it's never an entire figure. It's an arm, it's a shoulder, it's a abdominal area, it's a thigh. And so I think the idea is, borrowing the best from this collection of muscular forms. And then when it was time for him to put his artwork together, that's when he would kind of pull these different body parts to compose his final figure.
Excellent. Well, one student wants to know if Michelangelo's fascination with the male body illustration and paintings comes because he was romantically interested in males, or was he?
No, I mean, I know that seems like kind of the obvious explanation, everyone, but I think it's oversimplifying it. It's kind of too dismissive in the sense that, okay, there's one book written on the subject, and it was written by a dear friend of mine who taught with me at Syracuse University. It's called Forbidden Friendships, Homosexuality in the Renaissance. And chapter 1 of the book is essentially dismissing what we think homosexuality is today, because it wasn't the same thing.
Right.
Consider that same-sex relations between men was an incredibly common thing in the Renaissance, particularly in Florence, but it wasn't homosexuality. And so when you think of Michelangelo, I mean, if you're familiar, for instance, with the South American artist Botero, right? Botero's figures are all, I mean, it's almost like saying that his figures look like that because he's physically attracted to large people. Or Keith Haring, or, I don't know, think of a certain artist who has a particular angle or style, and saying, oh, that's just a personal thing. I think with Michelangelo, it wasn't so a personal thing. I think he really did just see the male body as this paradigm of perfection. And I think, his sexuality is probably what we know least about. And I think the reason is because Michelangelo kind of sublimated it into what he's doing. So I don't see any erotic angle on his or in his artwork as well. And I personally would hesitate from giving a kind of personal explanation as to why his art looks the way it does.
Sure. So here's an interesting question as well. Who was really more powerful, the Medicis or the popes?
It
Or did it
depends what.
depend upon what city you were in?
No, it all depends upon what period you're talking about.
Oh.
So remember, the peak of Medici power is about 1440,
Mhm.
at which point I'd say it's safe to say that they are the leading and most influential family in all of Europe. And popes are made and unmade by the Medici because they're bankrolling the papacy. Okay,
Right.
but consider that then the Medici, we have two Medici popes at the beginning of the 1500s,
Mhm.
Pope Leo X and Pope Clement VII. But that's also the beginning of their demise because they relinquish banking as a profession. They end up becoming dukes and then eventually Grand Dukes of Tuscany. But this is also the time of the New World.
Mhm.
And I've always said that the irony of Italy is that we discover the New World, we explore and chart the New World, but Italy never exploited it like the French, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the British ever did. So that yes, the Medici are dukes of Tuscany, but Tuscany is an insignificant place on planet Earth because there's just nothing there except it's past already, and we're talking 1500s or so.
Thank you. And then, real quickly, just kind of as a follow up, what's your opinion of the Netflix series Medici? Does it have authenticity?
Um, my opinion, no, my opinion is a very positive one. Anything that brings attention to this stuff, I'm all for. That said, I actually finally sat down. This was a few years ago now, and I watched half of the first episode of season one, the one with Dustin Hoffman playing Giovanni De Bici, and I had to turn it off. And I had to turn it off because there was so much historical misinformation. I was biting my hands. Um, and I was disappointed only because you don't have to fudge with the story. I think ultimately, the writers were trying to make it a bit more appealing to a modern audience. But for me, I mean, the truth of Medici history is more. I mean, it's like watching the Kardashians or something. Um, so I don't think they needed to. So I was ultimately disappointed. But that said, watch it, watch it, watch it, everyone. Because for me, again, I'm just glad that people are paying attention again to this particular period. And the ends justify the means, of course, as one particularly important Renaissance man said.
Good point. We have several students who want to know that whether Michelangelo had assistants to paint the Sistine Chapel.
So when he first signs the contract, he sends a letter to a boyhood friend by the name of Francesco Granacci, who had spent time in the same painter's workshop as Michelangelo. We actually have the letter, and it's essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, "Hey, Francesco, put together a crew. I have this great gig in Rome. You're going to come down." And I think Michelangelo's plan was that he would actually do the cartoons and then pass those cartoons off to the workshop who would execute the frescoes. That's what everybody else was doing. That's what everyone else did before and after Michelangelo. But I think once he saw the quality of their execution, he realized that and again, I wasn't there, everyone. I know I make it sound as if I was present when it happened, but I just get the impression that Michelangelo had difficulty passing off someone else's work as his own. And so I think he balked at that point. We know he got rid of those 5 guys. But that said, you cannot work in this medium alone. You at least need to have guys mixing the plaster, applying the plaster. You need guys mixing pigments. You need runners to go up and down those stairs because obviously if you had to, you never get finished. And personally, I think that Michelangelo also hired people to paint the architecture because that's kind of a waste of his time, obviously. But I think a majority of the figures are autograph. I think they're by Michelangelo himself.
Okay, and then that was into this next question that someone asked. Did all of the different scenes that the artist painted come out of their creative minds, or did they have like consultants or committees, people to assist them? Especially, I think of with Giotto and the composition of the figure groups, right? Then we go to Masaccio and then the figure groups, and then when to add his friends in, and such. is that all their own creative process, or is that dictated from what patrons also want? Because I know the patrons have a role in this too.
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything. I mean,
Mm.
nothing's changed because it's kind of the same today. Where if I'm the producer of a major movie and Ridley Scott's my director, but Ridley has a different vision for it than I do, but I'm the guy bankrolling it, so I'd really like, or sports franchises. How often do owners start micromanaging their coaches and what have you as well? Um, I think most important, everyone, is that Masaccio had Giotto to fall back on. Michelangelo had Masaccio and Giotto to fall back on. Giotto had no one to fall back on. I want to be clear about this. There are no press. Well, that's not entirely true. I mean, there was his teacher, Cimabue, but Cimabue wasn't even close to the sophistication that you actually see. But in terms of what is being painted, even for the Sistine ceiling, don't give Michelangelo too much credit because the programming is not his. In other words, a team of theologians would sit down and would map out what needed to be depicted. It was Michelangelo's job to then manifest visually what that looked like. The analogy I use is like in film. If I'm a movie director, I'm provided with a screenplay, and a screenplay is simply a bunch of words. As a movie director, my job is to translate the literary into the visual. And so that holds true for all these artists. Again, if I'm, Quentin Tarantino making a movie, I'm watching spaghetti westerns. I'm looking to see the way people did it before me. And just like Michelangelo used Masaccio, as I showed you a moment ago, Masaccio using Giotto, using other artists as well. And so it's a little bit of everything. It's the influence, it's the precedence, it's the tradition, but then also it's the personal touch of each artist.
Yeah. So then let me kind of end our time together. And again, thank you so much for being our guest lecturer. This was fabulous. A lot of people all the comments, they really enjoyed this. Did the people in these respective cities and the patrons or I guess attendees of the chapels, did they have a sense of the brilliance of that was surrounding them? I mean, do we have any evidence that they knew that, wow, this is exceptional what I'm looking at, when I'm in this Scrovegni Chapel and such?
Absolutely. I mean,
That's great to hear too.
no, but it's the very fact that they're writing about it.
That's right.
It's extraordinary thing. I mean, the Florentines, being a city of merchants, had this inane need to record everything. So we actually have diaries of people saying, today is the 27th of January, 2023, and it's nice outside, and earlier today I saw, they just write stuff down randomly. But the fact that Dante would mention Giotto, the fact that Vasari would sit down and write a compendium. I think there are 140 artists whose biographies he recounts. And then we can cross-reference because Machiavelli makes mention of, and so-and-so makes mention of Machiavelli. Folks, the equivalent I think would be something like late 19th century Paris, 20th century New York City, where you were there, you were living in New York at that time, Club 54. I mean, it was everyone was perfectly conscious that something magical was going on. First in Florence, then it moved to Rome. Venice catches up around 1500 as well. But it's also a matter of kind of following the money. And where the money went is where the artists also went. And that money then ends up moving to Paris, to Spain, to England, and what have you. And then Italy kind of loses its role as the forefront, if you will, of art at the time.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you. In the chat, everyone, so that is Dr. Rocky Ruggiero's website. Please check it out. He does a lot of webinars. There's a lot of classes, a lot of resources there for you, especially about the Italian Renaissance. And he takes you places live. If I may, I'm going to do a short plug if you don't mind. Or actually,
I appreciate
Rocky,
it.
why don't you do it on the 11th? Because this is really extraordinary opportunity.
So February 11th, we'll be live streaming from Venice. Now, what that means is that I have my camera crew on the ground in Venice, Italy, and we'll be transmitting from Piazza San Marco for Carnevale. if you don't know, the 2 weeks leading up to Ash Wednesday, sort of leading up to Mardi Gras, right, to Fat Tuesday, is when the Venetians are in their costumes and their festivities going on as well. So that we'll be transmitting live. I'll be sitting here in Rhode Island, but narrating over the images that you see. I have 2 cameras moving around the piazza and what have you. So it's a pretty extraordinary opportunity. And it really does, Eva Marie, you've done it before, so you know. I mean, you're sitting there in your living room, but you're in Venice. We've done it in Rome, we've done it in Florence, we've done it in so many different places in Italy, and it's a pretty extraordinary thing. So if you're interested, join us. This is February 11th, and you'll find it again on the website under our upcoming events.
So check it out. Everyone, again, thank you for your time in coming to hear this week's lecture. Thank you again, Dr. Rocky.
You're very welcome.
I was just so excited that you're here. As you can tell, yes, yes, everyone, I am a fan.
It's a pleasure.
So have a safe week, everybody. We will see you next Friday, and we wish you the best in your travels and keeping us smart, as you like to say.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone. Have a great day.